Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is Tuesday, or sorry, it is Wednesday morning at 9:30. Hope everyone's doing good. All is well here at Film Fanatic headquarters. I've been rewatching a shit ton of movies. A lot of movies that I bought the last few years. I've been getting back to watching them again. Again, one of the things I try to stick to with this channel is I typically, only talk about the movies that I actually own that are in my collection. The only exceptions are usually when I go to the movies and see a film. And with that, also there's an other exception or exceptions around that. Whenever I do a show on a movie that I see in the theater, I'll do a review, regardless if I think it was good or not. So I try to keep things pretty positive on this channel. So I try to keep that the focus. But your feelings are your feelings, and movies mean the world to me. So I want to talk about them as much as I can. So today's show is on a movie that I bought about, geez, probably like 3 years ago now. And I don't think I had ever seen this film as a kid. And I think that this movie, I rewatched it last night. I believe I did like maybe one show on this. I think it's a masterpiece. I think I did one show on this movie, maybe really early on when I launched this page, which was about 2 years ago or so. And I've seen it a couple times since then, and I watched it again last night. One of the things that's been happening to me is I've been kind of revisiting a lot of the movies in my collection and checking out movies I've only seen once or twice and realizing, damn, I need to put this in rotation because I look at movies as the same, almost the same thing. I have the same kind of habits around music, or I should say, I do it with both. But if I discover a band or I'm really into an album, I'll I'll constantly repeat it, come back to it, and it will be in rotation. And so that's a regular thing. I kind of get obsessed with a band or whatnot, and I'll just like take that deep dive. But I kind of do the same thing with movies. Movies, it takes, obviously with you when you throw in an album or listen to an album, it's like 40 minutes, 50 minutes of your time. Films are a little bit longer, but to me, it's the same kind of way of interacting with the media. If you really love it, you love it, and you just, you will want to revisit it. And that's how I am with films. And so today's show is on this amazing, one of the greatest, and I know it's a lot to say, but I think it's one of the greatest, if not the greatest, zombie movie ever made. And I never saw this movie up until a few years ago. I had heard about this film from a lot of different YouTube channels. This movie had come up quite a few times, especially with some of the channels that I watch where they specialize in all things exploitation. And I had heard that this movie was kind of like the stuff of legend. Like this movie was one of the greatest films in the zombie tradition. The whole zombie movie or TV show culture is massive, and Walking Dead, and there's been ever since George Romero came onto the scene, and Lucio Fulci, the zombie genre has been just one of the biggest genres ever for when it comes to horror films. I've always been a huge zombie movie fan as well. But I was really late to the game to seeing this movie up until a few years ago. I, again, like I heard about this movie quite a bit. I heard that this movie was, one of the greatest zombie movies ever made, and that there was something. I always heard too that there was, on a couple of guys that I watched, particularly, I believe it was Mood 616, who I've talked a lot about, who is a Canadian YouTube guy who is just amazing. He covers, all things exploitation. He covers other genres too, but his main thing is this genre. So he had talked about this movie a few times and said how this was like, just a classic that a lot of people don't talk enough about. And outside of, kind of the grindhouse kind of world, and the folks on YouTube who cover these kinds of movies, I don't hear this movie talked about really at all, which to me is really surprising because the genre itself, zombies, is massive. It's arguably, just as popular as, like, I think when it comes to horror films, the slasher genre is massive. Obviously, that's my favorite genre of all time. But I think commercially, it's in the genre of horror, I think the slasher genre is probably the most popular. But the zombie. But then I also feel the zombie genre itself might be even the biggest. Might even be bigger. And I really attribute it to just the amount of, when you look back, at the huge amount of films in this genre, it's kind of staggering, and it's there's been, you know, so many films. I mean, so many great directors. You have Lucio Fulci, Mario Bava, Bruno Mattei, especially. So many amazing films. George Romero was a major, obviously, to a degree, the godfather of the genre, but it's just so massive. And but I feel like The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue is kind of one of the darkest and one of the most atmospheric zombie movies I've ever seen, and in general, just one of the most atmospheric films I've ever seen. I mean, it just oozes with darkness. It came out in 1974, and it's interesting when you look this film up. It's under a different title, "Let Sleeping Corpses Lie," and it was directed by Jorge Grau, who is a Spanish director. And a lot of the actors and were from Italy, so there's like an Italian component to this film. Jorge Grau was I believe he's still around, which is wild. Pretty prolific director. Blood and Passion, The Legend of Blood Castle, Code of Hunting, Noche de Verano, Two Set Street. He was responsible for a shit ton of exploitation movies. I honestly am not all that familiar with his other films or his other work. Just this movie. This is the only film of his that I own. But I am definitely because this movie I feel is such an amazing film, I'm definitely going to keep my eyes peeled out for his other work, his other films. The special features on here are just amazing. There's a really great interview with him on this film. I watched this last night, and there's a really amazing interview with Jorge, and he was talking about how this movie kind of was essentially a a knockoff or a ripoff because again, it is an exploitation movie of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which is it's a masterpiece. But probably there's so many genres. I mean, so many zombie films in this genre of horror. Um, but I don't know. I think you have to kind of like pay it forward and say that probably Night of the Living Dead is probably the most influential movie in the zombie genre. I mean, it kind of ushered it in. And again, there were films that came out around at that time also in Europe that were also more or less zombie films, but I really feel that you know Night of the Living Dead really ushered in the genre where it acted like kind of a template for the genre, similar to Black Christmas. I think Black Christmas is that definitive movie when it comes to slasher movies. Like there were films that had those elements, and maybe even there were slasher films before that movie came out. But when that movie came out, it became like, I don't know, it was a real statement and acted as a real template for establishing a genre and became so influential. And I kind of feel like Night of the Living Dead, you know, is kind of in the same vein of things. And, Jorge talks extensively, about that, about them, about his idea of making a zombie movie with his producers, but then, really using Night of the Living Dead as kind of a template. But again, it's totally its own thing. I've always said too, when it comes to horror films in general, I'm all about the atmosphere. Even if a movie is, well, kind of shitty, not great, like if the acting's not great, or especially when it comes to exploitation movies, which, let's face it, sometimes that's the case, but that's, for me, is part of the charm. And I believe in that saying of, that classic thing you hear people say, it's so bad, it's good. I'm definitely, I'm a firm believer in that, because I think that really makes these films in my favorite genre stand out. And I've often said, like, getting back to the films with atmosphere that are just packed with atmosphere, it can be not, it can be a poorly executed film. Not, maybe the editing is crappy or the acting is terrible. But if it has that world building aspect where I can take that deep dive into this fantastical world, I'm probably gonna end up loving that film. And I have to say, The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, like it's hard to believe that it came out in the year that it did. Um, and it's again, it's one of those things of, I feel like it's a movie that's truly ahead of its time. Was and is. The atmosphere, and again, it's like to realize that this came out in '74 to me is just kind of just, it blows my mind, in all honesty. The atmosphere for this movie is, I think for definitely a zombie film, because this is definitely a zombie movie. But I think for a zombie film, or just in general a horror film, this film has some of the richest and the most deep kind of atmospheric um, aesthetics that I've ever seen. I mean, it's so, there's moments in this film where I think it's generally chilling, and kind of frightening. It's got some of the most gruesome practical effects in this movie that I think I've ever seen. And again, I am all about bring on the practical effects. I'm really happy that I've seen. I think there's always this cycle thing that happens in films and also with music. I think like with music, for instance, we started to see a return to a lot of recording artists kind of going back to the trying to capture that that old vintage sound, getting back a little bit more to that live sound of where you know it's actually a bunch of dudes in the studio recording, using even analog recordings, going back to and even using vintage gear, because things have become so modernized where at one point you kind of feel like are these artists like so consumed with the idea of making things so modern that it gets away from those classic sounds of the 70s. But I feel like that's happened in music where you do see people now going back to like kind of the old shit, the classic shit, and seeking out those old pedals, those old, recording techniques. So you're seeing that. I think you're seeing that in music. So I think those classic ways of creating art are gonna, people will always come back to it. And I think and for me with horror films, especially, with 2024 being a fantastic year in horror, one of the best years in recent memory. 2025, so far, it's not been very good. I'm hoping there'll be some good shit coming out, but I don't know. It hasn't been very good so far, and we're still early on, I guess. But like my comparison to music and technology and recording, older recording techniques, I'm starting to see, and I've been seeing more and more in a lot of these fantastic films that came out last year, a return to form of like really kind of bringing back practical effects because there's a beauty in it. There's a real everything feels much more organic. It feels real and I think for the creators of a lot of these films or those films, it's a more I think they have to rely more heavily on kind of their intuitive talent and their imagination. And The Living Dead Manchester Morgue is one of the primetime examples of like what practical effects can do. It's got some of the gnarliest kills that I think I've ever seen. It's literally, uber gruesome. It's a great story, great characters. The cinematography for this film is just real beautiful. Takes place in this really majestic kind of English countryside. Music is fantastic, uber creepy, and it's a little bit of a slow burn. It's there, and I think it's kind of centered on these two kind of hippies that are, traveling about through England, and the police suspect them of these like crimes, and they're under this investigation. And the first part of the film is about them kind of traveling and a couple of they run into the law, if you will, and a series of events happen, and it's really great how this film slowly kind of unfolds. And then when you realize that this film is a zombie movie, 100%, it's balls to the wall. Like it's super suspenseful. Again, the atmosphere in this movie is so rich and thick. Like you can taste the darkness in this movie. I absolutely love this movie. I think it's easily one of the greatest zombie movies ever made, if not the greatest. That's a lot to say. I realize that, but this movie is a masterpiece. I am, watching this last night, I kind of kicked myself for, man, I got to put this movie in my regular viewing rotation because, man, it's such a classic. I don't think enough people talk about this movie. And I think, there's only, maybe a few zombie films out there as big as the genre is. But I think there's generally only a few, films in this amazing genre that are generally creepy as hell and, where the film is scary, actually scary, and it gets under your skin. I think this is it. This is one of those movies. It's amazing. So yeah, I can't recommend this movie enough if you have not seen it. Um, this Blu-ray is just amazing. The transfer of this on Blu-ray is just absolutely gorgeous. Was put up by Synapse, which is a big, one of the more or less big premiering boutique labels out there. It's packed to the rafters with special features. Super awesome film. Can't recommend it enough. Thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.